Once a given work session has been wrapped up, in order to be able to pick things up where you left off the next time around, you'll certainly want to save what you've done. When doing so, 3ds Max gives you a couple of different options that you can choose from. Let's throw a couple of things in our scene and we'll see what we can do. I'm going to go ahead and grab a teapot and cone from the standard primitives. Then in the extended primitives, I'll make a hose and a torus knot. Your typical saving option will be to simply click on the application button in the upper right-hand side of the interface and choose Save. The command is also accessible on the Quick Access toolbar by clicking on the icon that looks like a floppy disk, and as a third option, can instead be activated using the Ctrl+S keyboard shortcut. At the bottom of the dialog that opens, notice the file extension for a file saved in 3ds Max is .max. When saving, you'll also want to be sure to specifically navigate to where you want to save your file. Max by default chooses the Scenes folder of the current project. As a side note, 3ds Max also has the ability to save to a previous version of the software, giving you the opportunity to have a little backwards compatibility. For version 2013, Max offers the ability to save in Max 2.12, 2.11, and 2010. Make sure you remember that, as it's the only way to get a .max file back into a previous version of the software. For this example, let's save our file as sample save, and we'll use the Max 2011 conversion. I'm going to be putting the file in the Working Files folder that coincides with this chapter. The file can now be opened and used in any 3ds Max version 2011 or later. If you're working on a file that's already been saved and would like to save that file using a different name, you'd instead choose the Save As command. To show you how that works, I'll be using a file named using Save As, which can be found in the Working Files folder. Let's go up to the Application button in the upper left-hand corner and we'll look at our save options. The one we'll want to use is Save As. Now before activating the command, let's read the definition directly below its name. When the dialog opens, keeping the file in the same Chapter 4 folder, I'll rename it Cold Drink. After naming the file and accepting the change, let's reopen the Save As command. Down in the lower right-hand corner of the dialog, just to the left of the Save button, Max also gives you an incremental save feature. It's that little plus sign. Clicking on the button keeps the file name and simply adds a number after it. This option comes in especially handy when wanting to save additional copies of your work, or you might maybe want to return to a previous or earlier version of a file. You see this often used in a real-world production setting. An animation studio, for an example, might want to save different versions of a file on a day-to-day basis. If they would then run into a situation where they needed to maybe return to an earlier point of the project, like let's say how things looked a couple of days back, they could simply open the file that had a lower number behind its name. If they would instead just keep saving over the original single file, they wouldn't have the opportunity of being able to go back to an earlier version of the project. You might find it helpful to use that same strategy in your own work. Use the incremental save button when you don't want to save on top of the original file. Now, another saving feature comes into play when you have a particular object or two in a scene that you'd like to save out as a completely new and separate file. With whatever you're wanting to save selected, you choose the Save Selected command. Let's select the green glass in our scene. We'll go up to the Application menu, this time choosing Save Selected. When the dialog opens, we'll save it out as glass only. Let's now open that file and we'll see how things look. If you're wanting to save a file in a format that can be used in another application, you'll want to use the Export command. Under the Application button, we'll this time choose Export, then Export. Now before closing the dialog, take a look at the definition of what export does. As you can see, you have quite a few different file formats to choose from, each being used as a way to work on a file made in 3ds Max in another software. Some options providing a cleaner means of exporting than others. You've got the 3ds 3D Studio format, along with both the DWG and DXF AutoCAD file formats. There's both IGES and OBJ, along with the Autodesk FBX format at the top of the list. For this one, let's go ahead and save it out as a 3ds file. We'll take it back to the Working Files folder for this chapter, and we'll name it Glass Only. When the dialog opens, it's usually a pretty good idea to preserve the texture coordinates. Once done, we can now use this file in any software program that accepts the 3ds file format. Max also has a handy way of saving things up in a way that saves not just the wireframe file, but also any additional resources that might have been built into the file. Like, for an example, images or pictures that were used in building the materials for the scene. To gather in that fashion, you'll use a special command called archive, which conveniently consolidates things in a single, easy-to-transport or store file. Here's how it works. This is a file named archive, which can be found in the Working Files folder for this chapter. Now, before we actually archive this thing, let me give you a couple of examples on when gathering up all your assets in a scene might come into play. If you're working on a project where you're using more than one computer, you want to make sure that when transferring over to another machine, that you're taking everything needed for the file to both open and render correctly. Archiving can help with that. Or when you're teaming up on building a scene with somebody else, providing them not just the scene file, but everything that was built into it. That again would serve as an excellent example of when to archive. Or maybe one more, a situation where you simply want to mothball a file for a period of time. And in doing so, wanting to make sure that the next time it opens, it does so without any kind of warning message popping up on the screen saying, "Can't do it, you've left something out." You archive the scene and you'll have not just the scene file, but the assets, the maps in other words, that were built into it. Here's how the archiving is done. Up at the application menu, we'll rest our mouse on Save As, then on the right-hand column, choose Archive. Down at the bottom of the dialog box that opens, check out the file extension that the file will be saved in. Archiving creates what is called a zip file, which is simply a single compressed file that acts as a kind of storage bin that can contain many files. Those files, like your wireframe project and all the images or maps that were built into it. Everything you need is contained in that single zipped up file. Leaving the name as it is, I'm going to go ahead and save this up in the Working Files folder for this chapter. When saving, a black screen will open up. This is Max's way of searching the file high and low for the needed assets. When it's done with its search, that box will close. Now, once a file's been archived, it'll need to be opened in order to be used. That's officially referred to as unzipping the file. You can do that outside of Max by right-clicking on the file name and choosing one of the extraction commands that pops up in the right-click menu. If when unzipping, you don't find any extraction options in that right-click menu, it's simply because your computer hasn't had any kind of specific extraction software loaded onto it. You can find a free unzipping utility by going to the web and looking on either of these websites. So there you go with a bunch of stuff that'll help out when looking to save the things that you've created. Review the options, then choose the best one for the job at hand when next saving out a project.